The forest was already quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, as if something is holding its breath. It was late afternoon, early autumn, when the light begins to thin and stretch between the trees instead of falling cleanly to the ground. I parked at the edge of a gravel access road in northern Japan, not far from the foothills of the Haida Mountains. Officially, this area was part of a managed woodland used decades ago for logging. Unofficially, locals avoided it. They didn't use dramatic words. They didn't need to. They simply said the trail did not stay where it should. And then they changed the subject. But that wasn't the strangest part. I had permission to be there. Written permission, stamped and filed. Obtained weeks earlier from the local forestry office. Rule 1. Without it, I wouldn't have come. The man who approved the permit warned me in a flat, procedural voice to stay on marked paths only. When I asked which markings, he hesitated, then said, "The ones that are still there." He did not smile when he said it. That detail stayed with me as I shouldered my pack and stepped beyond the first line of trees, because I knew, even then, that some paths here had a habit of vanishing. The trailhead was unremarkable, a narrow dirt track, no wider than a meter, bordered by low ferns and cedar roots pushing up through the soil like knuckles. A faded wooden sign leaned to one side, its ink sun-bleached, the characters barely legible. According to old survey maps, this path had existed since at least the early 1900s, originally cut by charcoal burners and later used by forestry workers. Multiple disappearances in the post-war years had been attributed to disorientation. That was the word used in reports. Not lost, not missing, disoriented. And that wording would repeat itself again and again. But what happened next would challenge that explanation entirely. I walked slowly, deliberately, counting steps without meaning to. The air smelled damp, metallic, with an undercurrent of decay that wasn't unpleasant, but felt heavy in the lungs. Somewhere high above, branches creaked though there was no wind. I recorded audio as I moved, narrating softly, marking time. The forest floor was uneven but logical, shaped by water and roots, the way forests usually are. For the first 20 minutes, everything made sense. And that was when the sense of unease began. The path started to curve, not sharply, just enough that I could no longer see where it led. I paused, checked my GPS, compass, and printed map. All three agreed on my position. The trail, according to the map, should continue straight for another 600 meters before intersecting an old service road. I took a photograph of the curve, following Rule 2. Take nothing but photos. I marked the time. 16:42. Then I continued, because at that moment, there was no obvious reason not to. 5 minutes later, the trail narrowed. The packed dirt gave way to loose soil and leaf litter, as if it hadn't been walked recently. My boots made a sound that felt too loud, each step sinking slightly, releasing the smell of wet earth. The trees seemed closer together, though I knew that was an illusion. Forests play with depth. I reminded myself of that. Still, I slowed down. The path markings, small reflective tags nailed into trunks decades ago, were suddenly harder to find. I located one, then another, but the spacing between them felt wrong, inconsistent. And that's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't fresh. That was the unsettling part. They were partially filled with debris, softened by time. Boot prints, roughly my size, moving in the same direction I was. I crouched, photographed them, noted their depth and angle. They didn't belong to me. I hadn't been there before. According to local records, no authorized personnel had entered this section of forest in over a year, yet the prints continued, steady and purposeful. They didn't wander. They followed the trail exactly, and then abruptly they stopped. Not faded, not scattered. They ended cleanly, as if the person had stepped off the ground and vanished. I stood there longer than I should have, listening. There were no birds, no insects. The forest had gone unnaturally still. I felt a pressure behind my ears, the kind you get before a storm, but the sky above the canopy was clear. This was the point where Rule 4 mattered most: reconnaissance. I had studied this area for months, read every available report. Several mentioned this exact detail: footprints that ended without explanation. At the time, I had dismissed it as exaggeration. Standing there, I no longer could. I checked my instruments again. The GPS flickered, then stabilized. The compass needle wobbled for a second longer than normal before settling. I told myself it was interference from mineral deposits. Northern Japan has plenty of them. Rational explanations exist for almost everything, if you look hard enough. But the path itself had changed. I was certain of that. The curve I had photographed earlier was gone. The trail now sloped gently downward, leading into denser growth. I turned back, expecting to see the bend behind me. Instead, the trail stretched straight and narrow, as if it had never curved at all. That realization settled slowly, like cold water. I did not panic. Panic leads to mistakes. Instead, I took another photo, then another, documenting both directions. The timestamps would later show something that still troubles me. The images taken facing forward and backward were only 30 seconds apart. Yet the lighting conditions were noticeably different. Shadows shifted in ways that suggested more time had passed. That discrepancy would become important later. At the time, all I knew was that the forest no longer matched itself. I considered turning back. Rule 3: never go alone. I had broken it, as I often do for this work, but I compensate with preparation. Still, being alone means your margin for error is thin. I spoke aloud, grounding myself in my own voice. The sound felt swallowed almost immediately, absorbed by the trees. I took one careful step forward, then another. The path underfoot felt firmer again, as if recently packed. And with each step, a thought began to form, unwelcome and persistent. If this trail could change behind me, what else could it change? That was when I realized I could no longer see the trailhead on my map. Not that it was far away. It simply wasn't there anymore. The line representing the path had shifted, subtly redrawn itself into a shape I did not recognize. I stared at it, certain I was misreading it. I wasn't. The forest trail I had entered less than an hour ago was no longer where it should have been. And somewhere ahead of me, something had decided I was worth leading further in. I stopped moving the moment I noticed the map had changed, because the worst thing you can do in unfamiliar terrain is keep walking while your mind is arguing with itself. I forced myself into procedure. Breathe, observe, document. I took a photo of the paper map in my hand, making sure the compass and GPS screen were visible in the same frame. If something was wrong later, I wanted evidence of exactly what I was seeing at 1658. Then I lowered the map and looked at the forest again, as if the trees might admit what they were doing. They didn't. They simply stood there. Straight trunks, dark needles, shadows pooled at their bases, quiet as witnesses. But that wasn't the strangest part. The trail ahead was no longer the same trail I'd entered. That sounds like superstition when you say it too quickly, so I'll be precise. The ground texture was different. Less leaf litter, more compact dirt, and the slope was slightly steeper than the survey profile suggested. The undergrowth on either side looked older, thicker, like it hadn't been brushed back by hikers in years. Yet the center line of the path was clean, not swept, just naturally clear, as if the forest itself had decided where feet should land. I've walked old trails all over the world, and when they fade honestly. They break apart. Grass grows through them. Roots reclaim them. This one did the opposite. It looked newer the deeper I went. I told myself I would retreat to the last point of certainty, the spot with the footprints. That was my plan. I turned around and walked back, counting steps again, marking the sound of my own breathing. After about 50 paces, I expected to see the clean end of those boot prints in the soil. I saw nothing. No prints, no scuffed leaf litter. The ground looked undisturbed, as if no one had ever stood there at all. And the silence felt heavier now, as if the forest had noticed my doubt. I crouched and touched the soil. It was cool and slightly damp, but not the same loose, soft earth I remembered from minutes earlier. This was firmer, packed like a maintained trail. I pressed a fingertip into it and left a shallow dent, then stood and looked for my own boot marks behind me. There should have been a chain of them, obvious in that soft dirt. Instead, there were only faint impressions, like someone had brushed the surface lightly after I passed. Not erased completely, just softened. The way a wave softens footprints on a beach. But there was no wave here. Only trees. I forced myself to follow Rule 4 again. Reconnaissance isn't only what you do before you enter. It's what you keep doing, constantly, while you're inside. I scanned for the reflective tags on tree trunks. One appeared on my left at shoulder height, then another further ahead on my right. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made my stomach tighten, because those tags belonged to the old forestry route, and according to the map, I shouldn't have been on that route yet. I should have been approaching the service road intersection, but I hadn't reached it, not even close. I walked forward until the trail widened abruptly, opening into a narrow corridor where the trees had been cut back long ago. The ground was scattered with rusted fragments, old wire, the broken end of a metal post, a half-buried plank. The air smelled different here, sharper, like cold iron and wet cedar sap. It was the smell of human work left to rot. That's when I saw something that shouldn't exist in this section of forest. A low wooden marker stood beside the path, no taller than my knee. It looked hand-carved, not official. The wood was dark with age. There were characters etched into it, old-style, uneven strokes, plus a small symbol beneath them that resembled a twisted circle. I photographed it from multiple angles. I didn't touch it. Rule 2: take nothing but photos. But as I straightened, a strange sensation crawled over my skin, like the air had thickened around me. The forest was still silent, but I became aware of something else. A faint rhythmic sound, barely audible, like distant footsteps pacing out of sync with mine. I froze and listened. The sound stopped immediately. I waited. Nothing. Then, as I took one slow step forward, the sound returned. 2 soft impacts, close enough that my brain wanted to place them behind my right shoulder. I spun around, heart ticking faster now, and saw only trees and empty trail. The sound had no source. And that's when the unease sharpened into a clear understanding. Whatever was happening here wasn't random disorientation. It was responsive. I spoke quietly into the recorder, describing the marker and the auditory effect. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the forest. When I played back a few seconds to check the levels, the recording contained a whisper under my narration, so faint I almost missed it, like breath brushing a microphone. It wasn't in Japanese, not clearly. It wasn't even words, really. More like a pattern, an inhalation, then a soft click, then silence. I replayed it again, and the same pattern returned. I had not heard it in real time, only on playback. That detail chilled me because it suggested something was present close enough to imprint itself on my equipment, but not close enough for my ears, or not close enough for my mind to accept. I started walking again, but slower now, and I began leaving deliberate markers that wouldn't damage the environment. Small, stacked stones on the edge of the trail, a strip of biodegradable tape tied loosely around a low branch, something I could later remove. I know, strictly speaking, it violates the purity of Rule 2, but survival outranks aesthetics. The taboo is taking objects out of the place. Marking your way so you can exit is a different kind of necessity. Still, I kept it minimal and reversible. Each marker felt like an argument against whatever was trying to rearrange my route. For a few minutes, that method worked. I could see my markers behind me, spaced evenly, like a breadcrumb line through the trees. Then the trail bent, again, gentle, almost innocent. And when I rounded the bend, I saw the same wooden marker a second time. The same height, the same darkened wood, the same twisted circle symbol. I stopped so abruptly my boots skidded. I turned and looked back the way I'd come. The trail behind me did not bend. It ran straight, like a hallway cut through the forest. Yet here I was, facing an object I'd already documented in a different location. My skin tightened across my shoulders. This wasn't déjà vu. I still had the first set of photos, time-stamped minutes earlier. I pulled them up and compared. Identical grain patterns in the wood, identical scratch marks, identical tiny chip on the left edge. The marker hadn't been duplicated. It had been reused. A thought landed in my mind, slow and sickening. The path wasn't merely moving. It was looping me, testing how far it could bend reality without me noticing. And then, as if to confirm that idea, I noticed something else. One of my stone stacks, the one I had built on the edge of the trail just 5 minutes earlier, was now sitting on the opposite side, as if it had been picked up and placed there with care. Not knocked over, not scattered by animals, repositioned, like a reply, like a warning. I did what I should have done earlier. I stopped trying to outsmart the forest and instead focused on getting out. I checked my GPS again. The coordinate readout still looked normal, but the arrow indicating direction spun slowly in a full circle, refusing to settle. The compass needle trembled like a living thing. I looked up at the canopy, searching for the sun as a reference point, but the light had dimmed far more than it should have. It felt closer to dusk than late afternoon, and the air had cooled fast, the way it does when you step into shade, except I had been in shade the entire time. I began walking back with urgency, but not panic. One foot placed carefully, each breath controlled, keeping my mind anchored in sequence. Marker, turn, tree, stone stack. But the forest had already rewritten parts of that sequence. And in the distance, faint, rhythmic, patient, I heard those footsteps again, matching mine. then drifting slightly ahead, as if something was walking the trail before I did. The footsteps grew clearer the moment I acknowledged them. Not louder, just more defined, as if my attention had sharpened their edges. They were spaced like human steps, heel to toe, measured and unhurried. Whatever was making them did not rush. It didn't need to. The sound came from ahead now, not behind, setting a pace I was expected to follow. That realization settled into my chest with a dull weight. Predators chase, guides lead, and that's when I understood this trail was no longer simply disorienting me. It was directing me. But that wasn't the strangest part. I stopped again, forcing stillness, and the footsteps stopped too. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Like a door closing. No birds. No wind. Even the distant creak of branches had vanished. My ears rang faintly, the way they do in pressure changes, and I became acutely aware of my own body. Heartbeat, breath, the slight tremor in my hands. I whispered the time into my recorder. 17:21. When I checked my watch, the minute hand ticked forward normally. Time itself, at least, appeared to be obeying its rules. That small mercy kept me grounded. I decided then that continuing forward was no longer an option. Loops only work if you stay inside them. I needed to break the pattern, even if that meant leaving the trail entirely. That's a dangerous decision in any forest, especially one known for swallowing people. But staying on a path that actively rearranges itself is worse. I scanned the terrain to my left. The ground dipped sharply into denser growth, tangled with fallen branches and moss-covered rocks. Difficult, but navigable. Before stepping off the trail, I documented my position one last time. Photo, audio note, slow breath. Then I took a single step sideways off the path. The change was immediate and physical. The air felt thicker, heavier, like stepping into cold water. The forest floor was softer here, uneven in a way that made sense. Natural chaos instead of deliberate design. My boots sank into moss and damp leaves, and for the first time in over an hour, the ground behaved like a forest again. I felt a brief surge of relief. I took another step, then another. Behind me, the trail remained visible, a narrow ribbon of order cutting through disorder. I turned my back on it and pushed deeper into the trees. The footsteps returned instantly. They were no longer on the trail. They were in the brush with me. I spun, scanning between trunks, heart accelerating despite my effort to stay calm. The sound wasn't crashing through undergrowth. It moved too smoothly for that. It was as if something else had stepped off the trail at the same moment I did, choosing to mirror my decision rather than oppose it. That detail terrified me more than pursuit would have. It meant the trail wasn't the only mechanism at work here. It was just one interface. I forced myself onward, angling downhill, using gravity as a guide. Eventually, any slope leads to water, roads, or open land. That's basic wilderness logic. But after 10 minutes of steady descent, the terrain leveled out abruptly, too abruptly. I looked up and froze. The trail was in front of me again, the same compact dirt, the same clean edges, the same faint curve disappearing between trees. I hadn't crossed it. I was certain of that. I would have noticed. Yet there it was, waiting, as if it had simply been placed in my path. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with a cold, creeping certainty. This forest didn't care which direction I chose. It could redraw itself faster than I could escape it. I stepped back instinctively, and my heel struck something solid. I looked down and felt my breath hitch. Another wooden marker stood behind me, identical to the others, its twisted circle symbol dark against the grain. I was between them now, trail ahead, marker behind, contained within a space that felt intentional. My recorder was still running. I spoke quietly, forcing words through the tension. "I'm being redirected," I said. "The environment is actively correcting my movement." Hearing myself say it out loud made it worse, because it sounded sane. Observational, factual. The forest responded. A low sound vibrated through the ground beneath my feet, so subtle I felt it more than heard it. Not a roar, not a growl, more like a deep exhale traveling through roots and soil. The trees creaked in answer, not from wind, but from internal strain, wood shifting under pressure. Leaves trembled though the air remained still. And then the trail ahead of me moved. I don't mean it slid like a conveyor belt or rippled like water. The change was slower, more disturbing. The curve ahead straightened, then bent in the opposite direction, as if the forest were calmly reconsidering its geometry. I watched dirt edges reform, watched leaf litter pull back from the center line. The process took perhaps 10 seconds. 10 seconds of impossible, undeniable motion. When it finished, the trail pointed decisively to the right, away from where I knew the access road should be. That was the moment fear finally cut through discipline. Not panic. Panic is loud and messy. This was sharper, focused. The understanding that I was dealing with something that did not operate on human logic, but was logical in its own way. It was conserving energy. It wasn't chasing me. It was guiding me toward something, or away from something. I couldn't tell which was worse. I backed away slowly, careful not to turn my back on the shifting ground. As I did, my foot brushed against a piece of fabric half buried in the soil near the marker. I froze. Rule 2 screamed in my mind. Take nothing but photos. I knelt and photographed it instead. A fragment of weathered cloth, dark blue frayed at the edges. When I zoomed in, my stomach dropped. There was a reflective strip stitched into it, the kind used on forestry uniforms decades ago. I knew then that others had stood where I was standing, not lost, not disoriented, redirected until they ran out of choices. I checked my watch again. 17:24. Only 3 minutes had passed since my last time check. It felt like much longer. The light filtering through the canopy had dimmed further, shadows stretching unnaturally long. Dusk was arriving too quickly, as if the forest were compressing the day. And in that dimming light, I saw something move between the trees. Not a shape, not a body, but a subtle displacement, like the air itself stepping aside to let something through. The footsteps began again, this time directly in front of me, perfectly aligned with the newly bent trail. Slow, patient, certain. I had one option left. One rule I hadn't fully used yet. Never go alone doesn't only mean physical company, it means maintaining connection. I raised my radio, standard emergency band, long range, and keyed the mic, broadcasting my coordinates, my situation, my voice steady despite everything. The signal crackled, struggled, and then something answered. Not static, not silence. A faint, rhythmic clicking sound, matching the pattern I had heard on my recorder earlier. Inhale, click, pause. The trail did not move again. It simply waited. And I realized, with a clarity that made my hands go cold, that whatever lived here didn't need to trap me forever. It only needed me to take a few more steps, The clicking came through the radio again, closer this time, no longer faint. It wasn't interference. Interference has texture. Static rises and falls, carries randomness. This sound was deliberate, measured. It followed the same pattern every time, like a signal repeating until it was acknowledged. I lowered the radio slowly, my thumb hovering over the transmit button, unsure whether responding was an invitation or a mistake. In that moment, I understood something that tied together every report I had read before coming here. The people who vanished didn't wander aimlessly until they collapsed. They engaged. And that was the strangest part. I did not answer. Instead, I switched the radio off entirely. The sudden silence felt dangerous, like cutting a lifeline. But the clicking stopped with it. Immediately. As if whatever was listening had been relying on my equipment as much as I had. I took a slow step backward. The trail did not follow. It remained fixed, curved gently away, patient as ever. The forest around me creaked again, not in anger, but in something closer to disappointment. I forced myself to think in terms of rules. Survival rules only matter when they're enforced consistently. The trail guided those who followed it. The markers reinforced that guidance. The sounds responded to attention. So I did the opposite. I lowered my gaze, stopped documenting, stopped narrating. I became quiet in a different way. Not frozen, not fearful, but deliberately uninteresting. Then I moved. I didn't run. Running implies urgency, and urgency draws attention. I walked sideways again, but this time I didn't fight the terrain. I accepted the uneven ground, the branches scraping my sleeves, the mud pulling at my boots. I let myself stumble once, deliberately, breaking rhythm. The footsteps behind me faltered for the first time. They did not stop, but they lost synchronization, like a metronome knocked slightly off beat. I kept moving downhill, using gravity and instinct, not logic. I did not check my map. I did not check my instruments. I focused on sensation only. The burn in my thighs, the smell of wet stone, the faint sound of running water somewhere below. Water meant boundary. Boundaries matter. As I descended, the forest slowly began to sound like a forest again. Insects returned first, then distant birds. The silence loosened its grip. After what felt like an hour but was later confirmed to be just under 15 minutes, I broke through a line of trees and nearly fell onto a narrow maintenance road. Gravel bit into my palms. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, but I did not linger. I stood, walked another 100 meters, and only then allowed myself to stop. When I looked back, there was no trail behind me, only trees, dense, ordinary trees. I exited the area before nightfall. Forestry officials later confirmed something that still troubles me. The trail I described does not appear on any current map. Older ones, yes, but not now. When I showed them my photographs, especially the marker, one man quietly told me his grandfather had warned him about paths that learn. He said they stopped maintaining that route decades ago. After workers reported it no longer led where it should. The disappearances stopped shortly after, not because the forest changed, but because people did. I returned weeks later with a team. The trail did not appear. The markers were gone. The forest behaved normally. That too fits the pattern. These places do not perform on demand. They respond to presence, to attention, to intent. Some trails don't exist to take you somewhere. They exist to see if you'll follow. I've spent years in forests across the world, and most of them are honest in their danger. You can read the ground, feel the weather shift, sense when you're pushing too far. This place was different. It didn't threaten me openly. It didn't chase me or try to scare me away. It offered direction. And that, I've learned, is far more dangerous. When a place starts guiding you, when it corrects your steps instead of resisting them, you stop making decisions. You begin to trust the environment instead of your instincts. That's how people disappear without a struggle. Not dragged, not attacked. Simply led somewhere they can't come back from. The 4 rules exist for a reason. Permission creates accountability. Taking nothing prevents attachment. Never going alone keeps you anchored to reality. And reconnaissance, true reconnaissance, means knowing when the map stops matching the ground beneath your feet. The moment you ignore that mismatch, you're no longer exploring. You're participating. The forest trail that moves overnight isn't unique. Variations of it appear in reports from Eastern Europe, South America, and parts of North America. Different trees, different names, same behavior, paths that rearrange, markers that repeat, sounds that respond. They don't need to exist all the time, only when someone is listening. If you ever find yourself on a trail that feels too helpful, stop. Don't argue with it, don't follow it, and don't assume it wants you lost. Sometimes being found is the real danger. If you want to hear more real stories like this, documented, researched, and told quietly, without exaggeration, follow the channel and stay close. There are many places like this in the world, and not all of them are done watching.